This week we're covering Chapter 14 in your textbook on cannabis. The primary active ingredient in cannabis is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. This is one of many cannabinoids. Cannabinoids are a class of chemical compounds that are found in cannabis. There's over 80 cannabinoids that are found in cannabis, and they can be prepared in several different ways to use. So depending on the part of the plant or how they're prepared, you've got marijuana that's typically smoked as a joint or in a pipe. It can also be vaporized or taken orally if it's baked into cookies or brownies or what have you. Hashish is dried sap from the cannabis plant that's typically smoked either by itself or mixed with tobacco. You can also consume that orally. And then hash oil is purified hashish. It's basically boiled in alcohol or another solvent, and then the residue is filtered out to get a more purified product. So then natural cannabinoids come from the cannabis plants. Synthetic cannabinoids can also be created, have been developed. Some with medical uses. These are often used to treat nausea, especially in cancer patients going through chemotherapy or other treatments that cause nausea. They can help improve weight gain in patients who are losing weight rapidly, whether from cancer or AIDS or any other disease that causes a low appetite or poor appetite. It can also treat some types of pain. Again, cancer patients are the classic example of who needs these drugs. So there's a few examples listed here, and there's others in development or that are used for research. Synthetic cannabinoids can also be used recreationally. These are the common ones, and in the past they were sold as incense, and they've been sold legally that way. So we're going to go through oral administration as well as inhalation for the absorption of THC mainly. Oral administration, just to remind you, is eating baked into something or taking a pill orally in the case of the synthetics that are being taken for medicinal purposes. These are highly lipid soluble molecules, so they dissolve very well into fats and not at all, hardly at all, into water. The pK is relatively high, 10.6, so it's not ionized in the body. So considering those two facts, that it's highly lipid soluble and that the pK is pretty high, it's absorbed pretty slowly. So you have to add oil to the plant to aid absorption. The book mentions a synthetic pill that uses sesame oil to dissolve the THC. So this poor absorption just means it's pretty incomplete. There's lots of first pass metabolism, so quite a lot's metabolized before it before it gets into your body and can have any effect. And because of that, the oral dose must be doubled or even tripled to have the same effect that an inhaling would have. Typically, the peak effects with oral administration are a few hours after it's taken, 1 to 3 hours after ingestion. Inhalation is generally much more efficient. You can inhale by vaporizing or through a joint or through a pipe. A water pipe is called a bong. There's a myth that holding the smoke or the vapor in your lungs makes delivery more efficient, or it enhances the high. And it turns out that's not true. The depth of inhalation is more important than the holding it in your lungs for some period of time. Peak effects with inhalation can generally be seen after about an hour, 30 to 60 minutes. In terms of distribution, because of the high lipid solubility of THC, the cannabinoids, These molecules are distributed throughout the body according to blood flow. So they end up becoming more concentrated in lungs, kidneys, and the liver. And a very small amount, only about 1%, actually enters the brain. And then the graph on the right side of the slide is figure 14-1 in your textbook. And this shows the time course for the intensity of a subjective high after consuming THC through 3 different routes of administration. So on the horizontal axis, it's time in minutes. 100 minutes is just a little under 2 hours. 300 minutes is 5 hours. You know how long a minute is. Vertical axis is the subjectively rated high. They asked subjects to rate their high on a scale of 1 to 10, and this is what was reported. So first, the oral is the long dashed line, and it takes a lot longer than the other methods to get high, and the high is not as high, but it also lasts a lot longer than the other methods do. Smoking is the dotted line. It produces a high much more quickly than the oral administration. Recall, I recently told you, maybe on the last slide, it's 30 to 60 minutes or so till peak effect. And then there's a much sharper drop-off than oral administration, with the line sloping down by 100 minutes or so. And then IV administration. This is not a common method of administration, but it was, I guess, done for purposes of research in this experiment. IV administration follows the smoking pretty closely. And just to point out, this is the effects, the subjectively rated effect of the drug, not the blood level of the drug or anything like that. Metabolism of the cannabinoids begins as soon as the molecules are in the body. Primarily, they're metabolized by liver enzymes. THC, the primary metabolite after it's being metabolized is 11-hydroxy-delta-9-THC. This is the first thing it's converted to. From there, it's converted to a bunch of different metabolites, and we don't know what all of these do. Some of them are active, and some of them are not. But 11-hydroxy-delta-9-THC is the first metabolite, and it penetrates the blood-brain barrier very easily. The half-life for excretion is 30 minutes initially. This is relatively fast, so the blood level drops pretty quickly. That is a large part because the cannabinoids are so lipid soluble. They're absorbed into body fat. So then as the body fat releases THC slowly over time, this is the second phase of excretion with a half-life that's much, much longer, closer to a day, 20 to 30 hours. And because of that long half-life, and that's going to vary depending on how much your body composition, how much fat you have, that kind of thing. But because of that slow release from body fat, the cannabinoids can be detectable, like in a urine test, up to a month, 30 days after ingestion. For the neuropharmacology of cannabinoids, we know that there's at least 2 different cannabinoid receptors. We're going to talk about CB1 and CB2. CB1 is found in the central nervous system, primarily in the cortex, hippocampus, cerebellum, and substantia nigra, whereas CB2 is found outside the nervous system, primarily in the spleen and the immune system. So the fact that these receptors exist in our body indicates that there's some molecule that can bind them that's naturally occurring in our bodies. And these are called the endocannabinoids. These are similar to the endogenous opiates. You can think of them as corollary to cannabinoids as endorphins were to opiates. THC is longer lasting and with greater effect on the receptors, but we do have these endogenous cannabinoids. So anandamide, ananda comes from the Sanskrit word for internal bliss, and 2-arachidonyl glycerol, or 2-AG. Those are just 2 of several different endocannabinoids that your book mentions. These primarily work as neuromodulators rather than neurotransmitters. So CB1 receptors are primarily presynaptic on the terminal buttons of the presynaptic neuron, and an enzyme that destroys endocannabinoids resides in or is manufactured by the postsynaptic cell. So when the postsynaptic cell is depolarized, when it starts firing an action potential, it can release an endocannabinoid that will bind at the CB1 receptors on the presynaptic cell. And that then blocks the action potential in the presynaptic cell, so that disables the presynaptic cell. So depending on what type of neuron the presynaptic cell is, whether it produces, say, GABA or an inhibitory neurotransmitter or an excitatory neurotransmitter, an endocannabinoid a cannabinoid, in fact, can cause either depolarization-induced suppression of inhibition or depolarization-induced suppression of excitation. So it's a way that the postsynaptic cell can affect the presynaptic cell. The postsynaptic cell can release these cannabinoids, these endocannabinoids, that can then suppress the presynaptic cell. And depending on what type of neuron that presynaptic neuron is, it can either suppress inhibition or it can suppress excitation. One hypothesis for the presence of endocannabinoids in our bodies is for stress recovery. So the idea there is just that if we had been under stress, natural stress, like fight or flight kind of stress, you can't sustain that physiological response for long or forever. So an endocannabinoid would help us calm down. And there's a quote at the top of page 319 in your book. Relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect might be some of the messages that are produced by the actions of endocannabinoids. There are a variety of physiological effects of cannabinoids. I'm not going to list all of these. You can read them, but recall that these drugs can be used for medical purposes to help patients who need to gain weight. So the munchies that everybody's familiar with from experience or pop culture or whatever is why the cannabinoids can be used in that way. Subjective effects also occur, altering perception, causing euphoria, and an increased appreciation of humor is what the book says. These drugs can also affect sleep. They cause drowsiness and increase sleeping time. However, high doses can result in restlessness and insomnia. So the medically useful effects of cannabinoids are kind of what recreational users would consider side effects. And then the recreational users might consider the primary effect, with these medically useful effects as side effects, and it's just the opposite for people taking it for medical purposes alone, where these side effects for recreational users become the primary effects for medical users. So it can treat glaucoma. The cannabinoids are both an antiemetic and they increase appetite. Antiemetic means that it stops nausea and vomiting. So between the stopping the nausea and vomiting and by increasing appetite, it allows for weight gain. We've talked about that before. It's an anticonvulsant, so it can be used in patients with movement disorders, spasticity, or Tourette's syndrome. Its utility in treating Parkinson's symptoms is unclear, but it's an anticonvulsant. And then it can also treat pain. It can decrease sensitivity to pain. And the book mentions that blocking CB1 receptors increases sensitivity to pain, so that makes sense. If cannabinoids then interact with those CB1 receptors, that would decrease the sensitivity to pain. And subjective pain lessens as well. So there's subjective reports of various types of pain being better when people are on cannabinoids. When people take these drugs for medical purposes, a lot of people smoke them with joints. This provides fast absorption, uh, but they're also available as pills, which, as we've discussed before, just makes the effect take longer and not be as strong. Sprays, sublingual sprays, are sprays for under the tongue, are available, and then inhalers are also being developed. So one of the effects of the cannabinoids are mood changes. People become happy, they have a feeling of well-being or euphoria. They also find humor in a lot more things than they might usually. And so if you're smoking in a social setting, you get this contagious laughing. If somebody starts laughing at something, it's likely to catch on to other people. People also tend to find mundane thoughts or mundane comments have a greater significance than they normally would. I'm calling this meaning making on the slide. And then mood swings. The user is susceptible to the moods of others. So if somebody else starts to have a mood swing, it's likely to be contagious. And the user, especially again in a social setting, the user's mood states have a big effect on each other's moods. Changes in perception. There's a possible increased sensitivity to auditory, visual, and tactile stimuli, but that seems controversial. And recall there's a loss of sensitivity to pain, so it's not all tactile stimuli. And then you also get time distortion, where people judge time to be passing more quickly than it really is. Effects on memory. It seems that there's no effect on a person's ability to recall material that they've already learned previously or on recognition, but use of cannabinoids does disrupt recall of words or stories, narrative material that weren't already well learned. So it looks like this is a disruption in short-term memory, and they're calling this temporal disintegration, which is losing the ability to retain and coordinate information for a purpose. So the example in the book is forgetting your idea halfway through a sentence, losing your train of thought halfway through a sentence, and not being able to convey that information for the purpose or whatever that you were trying to convey. Memory helps judge the passing of time, so this short-term memory loss, temporal disintegration, is likely connected with the time distortion, where people judge time to be passing more quickly than it is. And then finally, creativity. There's no solid evidence that creativity is enhanced, but this effect where people believe that creativity is enhanced with use of cannabinoids might be similar to the enhanced humor that I mentioned in the first, up on the top of this slide, where you find things funnier than you would normally. It's possible that you just find things more, and again, meaning making too, you find things more significant than you would normally, so it might be a similar thing where you find the creative work that you've done under the influence more meaningful or better than you might when you're not under the influence. There's certainly some tasks that are impaired by high doses of cannabinoids, but there's a lot of conflicting information on this, and the way that people are affected is complex. There's just huge variability between people depending on their experience with the drugs and with different tasks. So there's certainly some tasks that are impaired. For example, on tasks requiring speed and accuracy will be impaired before speed will be. You'll still be able to do something quickly, but just it might not be done right. Memory is impaired, so performance will suffer on tasks requiring memory. With driving, there's impaired performance for most people. Not necessarily a loss of control, but a loss of ability to attend to peripheral stimuli. So just staying aware of other drivers or road signs, things like that, that are not directly in the line of a person's concentration, And the book mentions that a person might be more attending to their own internal events rather than paying attention to peripheral stimuli. And then specifically, the effect of cannabinoids is more dangerous on driving when combined with alcohol or benzodiazepines or other drugs like that, which is not surprising. There's no standard breathalyzer for cannabis, so you can use these other tests instead. These are performance screening tests, or in Australia, they're trying to develop these standardized field sobriety tests. And it mentions that these tests were able to, they detected intoxication in very few people, 2.5%, who were given placebo, but in almost 40% of people taking a low dose of THC and over half of people who had taken a high dose of THC. So these three different tests are listed here. The gaze test is studying involuntary eye movements as a subject tracks a moving object. The walk and turn test is just somebody walking heel to toe up and down a straight line. And then the one-legged stand is, as it says, you stand on one leg and have to count or say the alphabet or something like that. So there's these different sobriety tests that are being developed, and the idea is that a police officer might be able to administer these types of tests on the side of the road with objective criteria. So drug state discrimination. Drug state discrimination is the ability to tell when you're under the influence, and people are able to discriminate THC from placebo no matter how it's administered, at least at most doses, at effective doses. And then there's a partial generalization to sedative drugs. This means that a person who's given THC might think that it's a different drug, specifically benzodiazepines or a drug like that. But there's no generalization to any other class of drugs. Like they wouldn't think, nobody thinks that they're on opioids or stimulants or hallucinogens. Tolerance develops pretty quickly within a few days to effects of THC on operant behavior, affects the increases on motor activity. This in animals, this is due to decreased receptors, cannabinoid receptors in some areas of the brain, as well as downregulation or desensitization of those receptors. So there's either fewer receptors around, or the receptors that are there are not doing any or as much in the neurons anymore. There's no clear tolerance to the increase in appetite. And then it's anecdotally reported that people become sensitized or have reverse tolerance. That has not been demonstrated in a laboratory setting. It's thought that the anecdotal evidence might be due to more efficient inhalation, as people have more experience smoking, or due to the social situations that people seek out to smoke in. And then withdrawal from cannabinoids is not severe. You already know that generally withdrawal symptoms are the opposite of the effect that the drug has. So it makes sense that a drug that makes somebody relaxed, increases appetite, and makes somebody sleep more, the withdrawal symptoms from that drug would include things like anxiety and irritability, a decrease in food intake, and a decreased quality and quantity of sleep. So I'm skipping the section on self-administration. Please do read that section, but I'm not going to go through it. You know that people self-administer marijuana. Marijuana is primarily a social drug in North America and Europe. Especially it has been, although it has become more solitary in recent years. Specifically, initiation is very commonly done in a social setting. Very few people try it for the first time by themselves. In North America and Europe, there are a lot of casual users compared with very few casual users in some other countries. The daily dose on average in North America and Europe is much lower than in other countries. It's 50 megs of THC per day on average in the US, compared with as much as 200 megs per day in some other countries. And then also, a lot of people in the US and Europe can start using it, but eventually stop using it. Whereas in other countries where the use is more extensive, people might use it for decades. And then the US use of cannabinoids has recently increased in general and specifically among young people. Um, and there's specific facts on that in your book, but just the fact that seniors in high school, their use is at its highest level since the 1980s. It's at 6.1%, so it's still only 1 in 20 or so students, but it has been increasing, and the perceived risks of marijuana have been decreasing, so that trend is likely to continue. So harmful effects of cannabis. There used to be a belief that cannabis was associated with violence and aggression. This may happen in some people, but it tends to be in people with psychiatric disturbances. And overall, in the general population, you see a decrease in aggressive behavior. It chills people out, it relaxes you. Now, I just mentioned psychiatric disturbances, and the cannabinoids can cause mental disturbances at high doses. At very high doses, they can cause anxiety and paranoia. Some people have an acute psychotic reaction. They call this a freak out, involving hallucinations and delusions. And then, again, there's this long-standing myth that smoking marijuana causes an increased risk of schizophrenia, but it's unclear that that actually happens. Cannabis use might hasten the onset of schizophrenia or worsen symptoms, but like everything else, it's unclear. There's not good evidence that that is linked. There's also conflicting reports on intellectual impairment and brain damage. There's no evidence that heavy cannabis use causes irreversible or permanent damage in humans. However, recent drug use is associated with lower scores on tests. And then finally, amotivational syndrome is exactly what it sounds like, a loss of motivation. So again, you see a lot of this in pop culture. So apathy, loss of effectiveness, diminished capacity to carry out complex long-term plans. You can read the lists there. So it is known that cannabis affects attention and memory, and attention and memory are necessary for educational success and to set career goals and that kind of thing. But it's not as clear cut as pop culture might make it. But in any case, people certainly do lose motivation and increase apathy, and that's been seen in animals as well. The book talks about an experiment where rhesus monkeys on a progressive ratio schedule reached their breaking points a lot lower when they were under the influence of marijuana than controls. They didn't want to work as hard for food pellets when they were on when they were exposed to THC. So the theme on this slide is that very few of these harmful effects have been clearly shown and are directly linked to cannabinoid use. So first is progression to other drugs. It's commonly thought that marijuana is like a gateway drug, and once you start using marijuana, you're bound to start using other harder drugs, heroin or cocaine, things like that. There is a greater probability that someone who uses marijuana will also use other drugs. The book mentions one study where virtually everyone on heroin had used marijuana before heroin, but this is all correlative only. There's no causal relationship that can be established. So it's not a cause and effect thing, it's correlated. One hypothesis to explain this correlation is a common factor model. The idea is that some people just have a higher propensity to use any drug at all due to their interests or their situation, their environment, what have you. and the book goes through a couple points there. First, people have different propensities to use a drug. You can think of a bell curve where there's a distribution in the population where some people are at one end of the spectrum and would never ever, be tempted to touch a drug. Most people are somewhere in the middle where maybe they've tried it a few times socially or they would consider something like that. And then some people are on the other end of the bell curve where they're very heavy users or feel like they need it, they have addictive personalities or they crave it or whatever the case may be. So with that different distribution in a population, that the idea is that propensity is correlated with the opportunity to use a drug. So some people have more opportunities to use drugs, and the probability to use the drug given the opportunity as well would be distributed on a bell curve. So you're more or less likely to use a drug. It's more about the opportunity to use drugs than the likelihood to use them if you're given the opportunity. And the book mentions a study from a few years ago, 2010, that the World Health Organization did on patterns of drug use in 17 different countries, not just the US. And drug exposure was a better predictor to predicting hard drug use than marijuana use. So the idea is that if you're exposed to drugs, you have access to drugs, you know people who do drugs or who can get drugs or that kind of thing. So you're exposed to harder drugs, and that's really the better indicator rather than the fact that you've used marijuana. With reproduction, it's shown that marijuana use lowers the level of testosterone in males, but it's unclear what biological effect that has. At least anecdotally, we've all heard that men should stop smoking marijuana if their partner, if they as a couple are trying to conceive. But it's unclear that really it has much of an effect on fertility. Newborns who are exposed to marijuana during pregnancy do have abnormal sleep patterns up to 3 years after birth, but quite frankly, a lot of kids have really abnormal sleep patterns. So there are sleep patterns that emerge when kids are a few months old or something. So I guess the sleep patterns of newborns exposed to marijuana during pregnancy are even more abnormal than a typical newborn. And then marijuana use during pregnancy can also may lead to hyperactivity, impulsiveness, and learning disorders. But again, these are pretty small effects, and it's not clear that it's directly due to marijuana use by the mother. With immunity, cannabinoids are known to modulate the immune system. I'm not going to get into details here because this isn't an immunology class, but they do affect white blood cells and cytokines. And it was originally thought to be purely antagonistic, that it was shutting down the immune system, but it's not so clear as that anymore. And in some cases, it might actually be beneficial. With Crohn's disease, one example, where basically autoimmune diseases, your immune system's working too well, so maybe that might actually help in some cases. Finally, with cancer, it's unclear if marijuana is carcinogenic, or it may be exactly the opposite of that and even be protective as an antioxidant, protecting against free radical damage. But it has been shown that marijuana accelerates the cancer-causing effects of tobacco smoke. So, like I said, almost everything on that slide I said may and has not been clear, and unclear if this is true. So, this is one case, I think, where it's important to just keep learning more and keep reading about what new research comes out. And as we understand more about a drug, we'll understand better what kind of effects it has, and these kind of, gateway drug ideas that have been around for a long time might eventually go away.